Hello and welcome back to Election Time News. Today I'm going to be getting right into it. I'm going to, instead of predictions, reviews, compilations, other forecasters, and the like, I'm going to be doing the first video in a multi-video mini-series where I'm going to be explaining the political systems of the United States, mainly focusing on the beginning of the series on the elections part. So this is the federal elections episode where I'm going to be going over the House, the Senate, and the Senate and the presidential elections. So I'm going to be getting to all of this, and then next episode is going to be the statewide elections. Are generally going to be governors, and then a little bit into state house and state senate, and some differences on how some different states do it. So first, to start things off, of course, the one that everyone always asks about is how on earth the Electoral College works. And honestly, the easiest way to start it out is actually to start by explaining how on earth the House works. And you'll see why in a bit. So to start things off, the United States House is basically where you have X amount of people in the country that get represented by one representative in the House. And it's divvied up among all the states. So in a perfect world, all of these House districts outlined in this thin white line have the exact same amount of population as all of the others. So this is a great way, is a very rough way to see population density in the United States. As you can see, some areas are very, very dense, such as central New York City has about 10 districts in this one small area. That is literally way smaller, maybe up to this corner right here, of the total area of Wyoming, which actually doesn't even have enough population for one district. But they get one because every single state does get at least one, and they are divvied out among the states. They do not cross state lines, which is why you can see each and every state. So that makes things a bit unfair, but it's the closest that we can get without taking away a large part of the state's choices on how to redistrict. I think we will get to in a little bit. So shown here are the results of the 2024 House elections. As you can see, the Republicans won 220 House districts and the Democrats won 215 House districts, meaning that Republicans have a very narrow House majority. So what this means is generally they'll probably be able to pass more legislation through the House that aligns with their party narrative and their ideologies, as they will most likely be able to get 220 votes for and 215 against, assuming that every single one is along party lines for their votes. Now, that very rarely happens. Generally, these days, with how polarized things tend to be, this is probably going to be somewhat close to the case, but still is not always the case. So there are a few bills that may end up getting shut down by more moderate Republicans, or some that may get signed onto by more moderate Democrats. So now looking at these districts, some of them are very jagged-edged, and some of them are very peculiar looking, but it's all about trying to get the equal representation of a state. In some states, generally the idea is to have an equal representation. So if, let's just say for Minnesota, if there are 55% Democrats and 45% Republicans in the state of Minnesota, then the goal would be to get 55% Democratic representatives and 45% Republican representatives. But because there's 8, the closest you can get is 50-50. So then it would be 4-4 with a slight Republican advantage there, which is about what they have in the state of Minnesota, but I just made up 55-45. It's probably closer to 50-50 than that. Now, of course, there's also rules about how you have to redistrict, such as that they have to be contiguous, which means that they cannot randomly just have bubbles hanging outside of each other. You can't have one part completely separate from another's, with the exception, of course, being off the coast islands, especially in the case of Hawaii. This isn't land contiguous, but because the islands are in fact separate from each other, they do get a pass on that. And also in California's case, these do count as contiguous, even though it is way off. It's a few dozen miles off the coast of the state itself. So using this, of course, there is the problem of gerrymandering, which is especially visible in states like Illinois or Texas, where you can see these very, very weirdly shaped districts that are drawn to crack, which is separating cities, which are generally very dense Democratic regions, and drowning out their vote in Republican votes. This is a Republican-dense region, and getting into the Democratic and less Democratic chunks of the city in order to get a safe red district out of it. And that is done to get an unfair Republican advantage there. There's plenty of videos on gerrymandering. I might make one, but there's currently plenty out there already. So that's an issue as far as redistricting goes. So a few states have done independent redistricting commissions, such as California. And so they actually have an independent group of people who draw the district maps to make it as fair as possible, to make some more competitive districts, such as this one. This one in here actually encompasses the southern part of Los Angeles, which is a bit more Republican. That this district, if the whole state was drawn by Democrats, would most likely have multiple stringing out here to take these two districts out and make them blue. But it's more fair as far as representation goes, generally, and so there was actually a bill proposed that I don't think even made it past a committee vote, for national independent redistricting committees, but I did not hear anything about that, so it probably got shut down in a committee vote there, or maybe the chairperson didn't even let it get to a committee vote. So there's the House of Representatives. Now, how on earth do they know how many each state gets? For example, South Dakota only gets 1, Iowa gets 4, Illinois gets 17, Indiana 9, Alabama 6, 7, and then Florida has 28. So how do they figure that out? Well, it's a calculation called apportionment, and now the algorithm used for congressional apportionment is done here, but this is basically what it looks like right now. Here's all of the current representatives, but the algorithm used is a method called the it's the Huntington-Hill method of equal proportions, which has been used since, looks like, 1940, and it's the method of equal proportions. So what it does is it basically assigns every single state a number where it has a priority number, and the state with the highest priority number is the state that gets the next representative. So they actually do get given a representative one by one to the state that has the highest priority number. Here's the number for the average constituents per member, which is right now obviously the highest it's ever been, with 761,000 people per member, which means that roughly each and every district has 761,000 people in it. And of course that's not the case, because every single state starts out with at least 1, which means that while there are 435 House members, you can see here, these states actually don't even have enough population for 1 House member. They automatically get 1, so that every single state does get, so there are no people that get 0 say in the House. So even though there are 435 House representatives to get distributed with the 50 originally, there are only actually 385 that then get given as doubles, triples, quadruples to all of the states. Now, there actually is a log somewhere where there were which state got which one next. Here is the actual equation here as far as that goes. It's an iterative procedure. 10,000 plus population over 100 minus 100. So then you also have the Wyoming rule. There's a lot of different stuff here. There's a Wikipedia article on it for the very minute stuff. But generally, there's a priority number that each and every state gets, and based on that, they get assigned a member based on that. So it does change every 10 years based on the census, where people live, and so that can account to make sure that it's always up to date on where people are living. So then, here we have the U.S. House. The United States House is one of the two chambers of Congress, the other being the Senate, which I will get to in a minute, but I'm going to get to the presidential first for a reason here, is that the amount of electoral votes that every single state gets is equal to the amount of House members they have, plus the amount of senators they have. Hint, every single state has 2 senators. So, that means that they have 2 more electoral votes than House members. Now, this does come up with a discrepancy here, because that means that all of these small states actually have a higher percentage of their electoral votes from their senators than their House members. For example, Wyoming doesn't even actually have enough population for 1 House member, yet they have 3 electoral votes, which means that they have 3/4 the voting power of New Hampshire, even though they don't even have half the population. So this comes up with a large discrepancy with a lot of power in the small states having more representation than they somewhat should for a true one-to-one democracy. Now, of course, this being in existence is a example of how we are a democratic, constitutional, presidential republic, as sometimes in some regions, for the benefit of some groups of people that might not otherwise be heard, they actually do get more voting power. So, in the end here, this is the presidential map of 2024, where Donald Trump beat Kamala Harris, 312 electoral votes to 226. So the Electoral College is itself its own thing. There is no physical Electoral College. It is a concept where there actually are electors, actual people, who vote for president. When you go and vote and put down on your ballot that you voted in, let's just say, Maine for Kamala Harris, or you voted in Indiana for Donald Trump, you are not actually voting for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. You are voting to say, yes, Republican elector of my state, I want you to cast your vote for Donald Trump. Or, yes, Democratic elector of my state, I want you to cast a vote for Kamala Harris. So there are actual electors that you are actually voting for. So the parties get electors for every single state, whether or not there's even actually any chance that they'd win that state. For example, even though Wyoming, Donald Trump won basically 2/3 of the vote in Wyoming, there were 3 Democratic electors for the state of Wyoming. And even though Kamala Harris won 65% of the vote in California, 60% of the vote in California, there were 54 Republican electors in the state of California. They have these picked out ahead of time. And then when you go and vote, you choose which slate of electors, that is the full group of electors from your state, the slate of electors, which slate, the Democratic or Republican slate, will go and cast their ballots in your state capital the following month, in the month of December. So then, in the state capital, they cast their ballots, the electors do, and they then officially put in the electoral votes of that state towards the candidate. This is the actual election itself, which is then confirmed on January 6th, or January 5th, or January 7th, depending on if January 6th is on a Saturday or Sunday, I believe. And so, for example, for Minnesota, the Kamala Harris won the popular vote here. So that means that the people of Minnesota would have decided that the 10 Democratic electors would go and cast their ballots in the state legislature in Minneapolis in December, and they casted their 10 votes for Kamala Harris. They are not bound to, they are not legally required to, they are not bound to vote for who they said they would. So in a few scenarios, you can get these things called unfaithful electors, where electors cast their ballots for a person other than the person that they swore to. Now, a few states are actually illegalizing unfaithful electors, which means that they have to cast their vote for who they said they would. But this is not true for all of them. However, neither in 2020 nor in 2024 were there any unfaithful electors, so it seems to be not that large of an issue anymore, even though in 2016 there was actually a record number of unfaithful electors, all of whom from states that Hillary Clinton won, especially the state of Washington, where I believe almost 4 or 5 electors gave their votes to someone other than Hillary Clinton, including to spotted eagle, who was actually, a fun fact here, the first Native American to get any electoral votes in the Electoral College. So, each and every state essentially holds their own popular vote election, and then that tells the electors of the state which slate of electors should go and vote. So in Michigan, this cycle, Donald Trump won by just over 1.5 points, if I'm correct. So the state of Michigan said, we want the slate of 15 Republican electors to go and vote for Donald Trump. Then on January 6th, 2025, Congress certified these electoral votes of each and every state, certifying that they were valid and that they should be counted, and the electoral vote added up, and we ended up with 312 for Donald Trump and 226 for Kamala Harris. So the election itself is far beyond just Election Day. Now, there is one more thing still left with the presidential election, and that is Washington, D.C. It does not get any House representation or senators whatsoever, yet it still has 3 electoral votes. It has its own constitutional amendment passed, I believe, in 1964, 1963, one of those two. I believe it was during Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, where D.C. gets the same amount of electoral votes as the lowest population state in the entire nation, which is Wyoming, so it gets 3. It would actually get 3 if it was added into apportionment as far as its population goes. And of course, if you add it into apportionment, then you'd end up losing a few in some other states in order to make up for it. But it would still have 3, as its population is, I believe, 600,000 something. So it's right about where it should be, but there's 3 electoral votes that are added there from 435 plus 100 senators. That's 535 plus 3 for DC is the total 538 electoral votes. Divide by 2, add 1, that is 270 electoral votes needed to win, which is, of course, if you were paying attention, was the number thrown around a lot over every single election cycle. 270 electoral votes needed to win the White House. So the presidential election is 51 popular vote contests that then get a small group of people to go and vote for one of the candidates, whose vote is then certified in Congress. The Senate. This is the current standings of the Senate as of, I believe they were sworn in January 5th, 2025. And this will no longer be the accurate standings on January 5th, 2027, when the next group of senators are sworn in. But the idea is still the same. Each and every state, does not matter how small or large of a population they have, they get 2 senators, and there are 3 classes of senators. So because there are 50 states, there's 100 senators, and each one gets a 6-year term. So this makes the math a bit weird. So what we ended up doing is we used the multiples 2 and 3, so that every single state has an election every 2 out of 3 Senate cycles, which is every 2 years. So there's Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. 2024 was a Class 1 election cycle year. 2026 will be a Senate Class 2, and 2022 was a Senate Class 3, and also 2028 will be a Senate Class 3 when the next presidential election goes up. So, what this means is that every 6 years there will actually not be a Senate election in any given state. However, that's not always the case due to special elections, which is going to be the case in Ohio. Ohio will have a special Senate election during the Class 2 year, which is 2026, even though it wouldn't normally, to have the seat that was set up by the Ohio legislature put in a replacement for J.D. Vance, since he was the senator, the Class 2 senator from Ohio. He was elected in 2022, right here in Senate Class 3, and he obviously couldn't have been replaced as he hadn't won the vice presidency yet in Class 1. This was where Sherrod Brown lost his election in Ohio, and so he will have his seat go up for election in the Senate Class 2, which will be a special election. This happened in Nebraska this year. If I can find the... I might have not had it here, but there was a special election in Nebraska this cycle, and there are sometimes multiple special elections as well if there are vacancies that have recently just opened, to make sure that the legislature appointed nominee doesn't just get to stay in office for the rest of their term. They have to win an election in order to actually win in the rest of their term, which is what will happen for the Ohio seat in the second Senate. And that will also happen in Florida to replace Marco Rubio, who is also going to be in Donald Trump's cabinet. I believe he was officiated into his cabinet as Secretary of State. I'm not 100% sure about that. So, all of these are all general, normal, popular vote contests. Whoever wins, they get to hold on to their seat. So, the Senate is probably honestly the easiest one to understand here. 2 per state. The most complicated part is probably the election schedule. And it's every 6 years the senators go up for re-election, and every 2 years there is a round of Senate elections, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. So based on that, that is basically how most of the national level elections work. The House gets reapportioned every 10 years. The maps are drawn by either the legislatures or the independent commissions. And then there's a popular vote contest based for every single district in order to figure out who will hold that seat in the House. For the presidency, every single state holds a popular vote contest, and based on that, a slate of electors goes to the state capitol and votes for a candidate. Those electors' votes are then confirmed in early January. And then for the Senate, it is a popular vote contest every 6 years for 1 seat, and there are 2 seats. So every 2 out of 3 Senate election rounds, your state will vote. The entire state will vote for a senator. There are not Senate districts. The entire state votes for the same senator. And then that cycles out over 3 classes every 6 years. Thank you all so much for watching, and make sure to watch my state elections video as well.